Hi, thank you for joining me for Virtual Symposium. My name is Lydia Reedstrom and I'm a psychology major. The title of my independent study is Parasocial Attachment, Framework and Function. To begin, I'd like to define a couple of key terms for you. A big part of my independent study centered around attachment, which is a specific psychological term that refers to the deep emotional bond between two people. Attachment was first studied in the parent-child relationship, specifically with infants and their mothers. Later research has broadened the focus to include attachment in childhood and adolescence and in adult life, like the bond between two romantic partners. The second term you'll need to know is parasocial relationship. A parasocial relationship is a one-sided and non-reciprocal relationship between two individuals. The object of the relationship is often unaware of the other person, making it possible for that object to be a celebrity or other media figure and even a fictional character. Now that we have these terms, I'd like to go a bit more in depth to set up the rest of my independent study for you. To dive into attachment theory, I'd like to first discuss attachment behaviors. Attachment behaviors were characterized by psychologist John Bowlby. These behaviors were selected for during the period of evolutionary adaptedness because they promoted infants' protection and survival, which in turn led to humanity's continued survival in a hostile environment. The three main attachment behaviors, which provide the framework for attachment theory, are proximity seeking, secure base, and separation protest. Proximity seeking refers to behavior that brings the infant physically closer to the attachment figure or the caregiver. Think of how babies and kids want to be near their parents, especially when they're younger. Secure base refers to the infant's use of the attachment figure as a safe haven from which to explore their environment. The infant feels safe enough to explore, knowing they can return to their caregiver when they're afraid or distressed. A shy kid hiding behind his mother and then venturing out to meet a new friend is an example of this. Separation protest refers to behavior like crying or distress at the leaving of the attachment figure. Think of how babies often cry when their parents leave their line of sight, or how kids will cry when they have to leave their grandparents' house. Observation of these behaviors during laboratory studies by Mary Ainsworth led to her classification of different attachment styles based on the quality of the bonds between infants and their mothers. She observed infants' reactions to repeated separations from and reunions with their mothers to determine three different styles: secure, anxious, and avoidant. Secure attachment is the most prevalent and results from warm, responsive, and reliably available caregiving. Anxious attachment is less prevalent and results from warm and mostly responsive, but sometimes unreliable caregiving. This teaches the child to be anxious about the response of their caregiver. Avoidant attachment is also less prevalent and results from unresponsive and unreliable caregiving that teaches the child not to rely on their caregiver. While categorization is helpful, it is also useful to think of attachment security, anxiety, and avoidance as dimensions that all people have some levels of. Securely attached individuals can have some levels of attachment anxiety and avoidance, while insecurely attached individuals can have some level of attachment security. For my independent study, I used both attachment categorization and dimensionality. To wrap up our discussion of attachment theory, I'd like to introduce the idea of secondary attachments. These are attachment bonds outside of that to the primary caregiver, so attachment to a sibling or a friend. Secondary attachments are even formed to objects, like one's car or cell phone, God, and finally, fictional characters. Attachment to fictional characters is the focus of my independent study. To move on to the second piece of my independent study, I'd like to go over the basics of parasocial theory. The first term I'd like to discuss is parasocial interaction. Parasocial interaction was first observed in the 1950s when the rise of television gave birth to a new phenomenon. In watching the news, people began to have a sort of imagined intimacy between themselves and the newscasters, where they felt that the newscaster was addressing them directly, sort of like a friend. Researchers defined a parasocial interaction, or PSI, as a one-sided social interaction between a viewer and a media figure. This was limited to the viewing experience, so once the broadcast ended, the PSI stopped. You're already familiar with the term parasocial relationship, or PSR. A PSR is a step beyond a PSI and is not limited to the viewing experience. Research has found that parasocial relationships function like real-life relationships and provide some of the same benefits, like positive emotions, an increased sense of belonging, and increased self-confidence. There is also an established association between parasocial relationships and attachment style. Those with anxious attachment are the most likely to form these relationships, while those with avoidant attachment are the least likely. Now, another term, parasocial attachment, or PSA, refers to a bond that's even stronger than a parasocial relationship. Parasocial attachment is a form of secondary attachment and elicits the same attachment behaviors as traditional attachment bonds. This is evidenced in research by parasocial breakup, which is distress at the idea of favorite characters being written off their show or dying. This is a form of separation protest. With these theories in mind, I decided on the direction of my independent study based on 4 things. 1. There is a gap in the research, and that no study has empirically demonstrated that parasocial attachment elicits traditional attachment behaviors. This has just been theorized. 2. There is a debate in the research regarding the function of parasocial relationships and parasocial attachment. Some say that it's compensation for lacking real-life relationships, while others believe that they complement existing relationships through shared interest and engagement. 3. In the research, there is a large focus on the negative aspects of parasocial relationships and attachment, such as obsession with and worship of celebrities. There is little focus on the adaptiveness of these relationships. 4. Finally, few studies have focused exclusively on attachment to fictional characters, so I wanted to do just that. I conducted 2 studies for my IS. The first study focused on the framework of parasocial attachment. My research questions were, does parasocial attachment elicit attachment behaviors, and how does attachment style impact parasocial attachment? For this study, I created my own measure for parasocial attachment that captures the attachment behaviors of proximity seeking, secure base, and separation protest. For parasocial attachment, proximity seeking would include rewatching favorite TV shows. Secure base would include watching favorite shows or reading favorite books when you're feeling stressed or in a bad mood, and separation protest would include being upset at the idea of your favorite character dying. I've listed my hypotheses for you, but to sum it up, I hypothesized that yes, parasocial attachment does elicit attachment behaviors, and that parasocial attachment would follow the same pattern as parasocial relationships, with anxious attachment being the most likely and avoidant attachment being the least likely to form parasocial attachments. For study 1, I measured parasocial relationships and attachment style. I had 176 participants that were recruited using a snowball sampling, which means participants shared the survey link with anyone they thought would be interested in the study. Most of my participants were female, and the average age was 28. Ages ranged from 18 to 83. Participants were asked to think of and name their favorite fictional character and list what kind of media they came from, like a movie, a book, or a video game, and what age they were when they were first exposed to that character. Some major findings from this study were that yes, parasocial attachment does elicit attachment behaviors, and that there is a significant correlation between parasocial attachment and parasocial relationship, which makes sense. Also, most people were exposed to their favorite character in adolescence, which I found interesting. When considering attachment dimensions, attachment anxiety positively predicted parasocial attachment, while avoidance negatively predicted it. This aligns with the pattern found for parasocial relationships. When looking at attachment styles, those that had avoidant style engaged more in parasocial relationships and attachment than those with a secure style. This directly contradicts previous studies, which find avoidant style to engage the least parasocially. My second study focused on the function of parasocial relationships and attachment through the lens of social needs. Previous research has shown that parasocial relationships can fulfill some social needs. I also found a study that split parasocial relationships into 2 types, parasocial friendship and parasocial romance, and I thought that these different types might serve different purposes for people depending on attachment style and social needs. For this study, my research questions were, how do attachment style and social needs impact parasocial relationships, and what function do they serve? I've listed my hypotheses again, but to sum it up for you, I hypothesized that greater social needs would be associated with both kinds of parasocial relationship, and that anxious attachment would have the strongest relationship with both PSRs. I also looked at relationship status to see how it would impact my variables. For study 2, I measured need to belong, need for social support, and perceived social support, attachment style, romantic status, and parasocial friendship and romance. I had 96 participants recruited using the snowball sampling method again. Most of my participants were female, and the average age was 23, with a range from 18 to 73. Participants identified a character they felt a friendly affinity for, and a character they felt romantic feelings for. They listed the characters' media and the age they were first exposed to them. Some major findings from this study were that greater need to belong was associated with stronger parasocial friendship and parasocial romance. Greater need for social support was associated with stronger parasocial friendship, but not parasocial romance. Romantic status had no effect on either type of parasocial relationship. Like with Study 1, most people were exposed to their friend and love characters during adolescence. When looking at attachment anxiety predicted both parasocial friendship and romance. Like with Study 1, individuals with avoidance style had greater scores for parasocial relationships than secure individuals. This was really surprising because it contradicts previous studies and it shows my results from Study 1 might not have been an artifact from my sample or methodology. I'd like to wrap up my discussion of my independent study with a look at some real-world implications and suggestions for future research directions. A big thing to remember about my studies is that they took place during a global pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to increased feelings of isolation and loneliness, and TV viewing and streaming has increased exponentially in 2020. People may be turning to fictional characters and worlds to help mitigate these feelings of distress. They may be engaging in parasocial relationships and attachment without even knowing it. These characters are acting as a secure base for some people, and parasocial relationships and attachment may be helping them get through tough times right now. My second study shows that parasocial relationships fulfill some social needs for people. Using fictional characters to fulfill social needs during this pandemic is adaptive. Future research should consider the therapeutic potential of parasocial attachment. Attachment security priming is a process that involves having people think about positive attachment experiences and results in increased positive affect and self-esteem. It would be interesting to see how priming people with parasocial attachment figures, like their favorite character, might compare to that effect. Another area to examine parasocial attachment in is bibliotherapy. Bibliotherapy involves using books and stories and the characters within them in the therapy setting to help people work through their real-life problems. I would like to know if using TV shows and movies and the characters within them might be as effective. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed learning about my independent study.